Our second speaker is Dr. Francis Costello, who's going to talk about the American connection.
Thank you very much, Eamon. And it's been said that public speakers should be careful of following dogs and children. I would certainly add Adele's wonderful harping to that list in terms of anybody. And thank you, Adele, very much for that beautiful performance tonight. But it's just great to follow you and obviously in the footsteps of Dr. Phoenix, and welcoming my friend James Dingley will be following immediately after me. Two men very much involved, not just in academia alone, but in terms of the practical side of conveying knowledge and working with people. And I think it can be said for the three of us that we also enjoy learning together from people that we meet and people that we listen to and engage with. That's part of learning and part of what we transport and our travels along the way. This is not a PowerPoint night, but I will give you a little bit of homework, and I'll pass it just scattered, shot around the room. And if you could all take something from me here and just pass back and share with you. There may not be enough for everybody, but if you could share some of these, do one between a couple, and some will come forward, just pass some backwards. I'll pass some other side of the room. This, as Eamon said, is a truly historic church. Its second manifestation was indeed of the Roseby Street Presbyterian Church, where the funding came and where the honor guard came for opening St. Mary's at Chapel Lane all those years ago, which Eamon very articulately referred to the importance of that day in Belfast and what it represented in terms of the coming together of people from the city that represented a very important, hopeful time. And we meet again in a different day and still hopefully a hopeful time. This is my 21st year entering and living in Belfast with my wife Anne and our children. One of our sons is here tonight. And it's a great city. It's a great city I'm learning from also, and great to be here. I've just come from Boston, where I was for the last 10 days. Before that, Pennsylvania, and before that, New York. So when we speak about the American Revolution and we talk about crossing the Atlantic, in many ways I like to refer to as twirling across the Atlantic. Because with respect to United Irishmen, our communities of Catholic, Protestant, and non-believers, of Unionists and Nationalists, and those who went to America. In Pennsylvania alone, 300,000 people from these parts had gone to settle Pennsylvania over 30 years. It's an amazing effect from Philadelphia all the way to what was, by the 1840s, calling themselves in Pittsburgh the Athens of the West, because that's where the West extended before there was a Chicago. But I say twirling across the Atlantic, the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas we'll be hearing from expressed very well by Dr. Dingley in a short while. But the fact is that it wasn't a one-way street. It wasn't ideas from America coming to Belfast or from France to Belfast, but ideas that began also here in the case of Francis Hutcheson, the splendid Francis Hutcheson, as Benjamin Franklin knew of him and referred him to Thomas Jefferson directly, who wrote about the pursuit of happiness for the greatest number right here in this place, who left Killinchy, left Killyleagh and went to Scotland. He had his difficulties in the pulpit in his home place. Often a prophet is not regarded in his hometown, a home village, as we know, not just unique to here, became what was known as the father of Scottish Enlightenment, but he's buried in Dublin, right down near Trinity Street. Right now it's called, ironically, Wolfetone Square, near Henry Street in Dublin. That's where Francis Hutcheson, we believe, rests. He lived only till 1747, but what an impact he had. Because that phrase, the pursuit of happiness, found its way into the American Declaration of Independence. What I've showed you tonight, or given you a copy of, first off, is the Belfast newsletter. What I cannot comprehend is how it only took 7 weeks to get here, and travel time was often 8 to 10. But August 27, 1776, just 7 weeks after the American Declaration appeared in Philadelphia, signed in Philadelphia, published in America, the first place on this world outside of those colonies that published this declaration was this town, this newspaper. That's an amazing credit to it. But it was not done by accident, it was done by reason. Those ideas resonated. But in many ways it bounced from Hutcheson, from here, to Mr. Jefferson's pen. Jefferson and Monticello had the 2 volumes of Hutcheson's work, as we know. And oddly enough, by 1776, by that point in time, as Tom Paine underscored, the great radical who knew well of Hutcheson's work through his contact with Franklin and the coffee houses of London, the same Franklin who had been here, who stayed in Hillsborough, who reported directly back to Jefferson as a roving diplomat in the early 1770s, a man in his mid-70s, I might add. That was Franklin. Jefferson was 32. Paine was 37. Paine gets to America only in February of 1774 and writes that classic work, Common Sense, and later, The American Crisis. It is common sense that is the intellectual treatise of the American Revolution that leads the Declaration. When you first look at the colonial legislator that Jefferson was writing to the king from the Virginia Declaration in the early 1770s, in tones beseeching you to treat us as your subjects, and how radically that would shift within a matter of 4 years to, in the Declaration, starting off respectfully, when in the course of human events people divide, if you read the language of that Declaration. But there's something more radical what Paine was articulating. But Paine had been known in Dublin. Paine, who had become a friend of the Fitzgerald family. Lord Edward Fitzgerald, we know of. He became a member of that parliament, appointed, really arranged a procurement through his brother. When we think of Lord Edward Fitzgerald, quoted in Dáil Éireann and Oireachtas by President Kennedy in June of 1963, he did not live for an uprising. He was killed before that in a skirmish in Dublin. But in 1773, or actually 1777, I should say, he was involved as a British officer, a redcoat as it were, a young lieutenant in the southern colonies, who was wounded and left for dead in a skirmish. Lord Edward Fitzgerald was a British officer. He was a redcoat in 1776, 1777. He sought a career in the British Army. That's what he aspired to within British society. He was found wounded, left for dead, by a runaway black slave who was given the name Tony Smalls. Tony Smalls saw this man moving and brought him to his little hut and helped him recover. They became friends for life. He brought Tony Smalls to Europe, brought him to Ireland, went with him to France. Never owned him as a slave, but he learned about liberty from that young man who had escaped from human bondage. That led to the radicalization. It's the ultimate idea in many ways of something crossing the waters, as that was. So in terms of, it wasn't just simply the world stood still and something happened in America and something happened here and something happened in France. But Fitzgerald went to Paris, and from that transformation forswore his title. That's who Lord Edward Fitzgerald became, from what he was. But in looking at Paine and what Paine represented, learning from Hutcheson, and Hutcheson, who very much inspired the American Revolution, the American Declaration, and also the French Revolution. When you took the oath of the United Irishmen Society, which became radicalized from being a democratic constitutional organization by the Crown's efforts to suppress it. It did not start off as a violent revolution to overthrow a government, but to seek Catholic rights, to seek the rights of a society based on Catholic Protestant center. I draw attention tonight, as I'm here, to the group, just digress for a second, called Reclaiming the Enlightenment. And at the back, as you leave, there are some papers to sign up for that organization. A sister organization very much like the Ulster Historical Foundation for all 9 counties of Ulster, which studies history and family history, and Fenton you'll be hearing from later on. I'm proud to be a trustee with Eamon of that organization. But with respect to what ruminated from Paine's pen in America in writing Common Sense, inspired by Francis Hutcheson, encouraging developments in France after the American Revolution, the oath that was taken by the United Irishmen when driven underground as a secret society appeared this way. This was the oath: "Are you straight? I am. How straight? As straight as a rush. Go on then. In truth, in trust, in unity and liberty. What have you got in your hand? A green bow. Where did it first grow? In America. Where did it bud? In France. Where is it going to be planted next? In the crown of Great Britain." What I've given you, as well as that American Declaration published by the newsletter, is something with a red hat appearing on top, and that is the flag of the French demi-brigade of Humber that came in through Killala Bay on 22nd of August in 1798. And it's a combination of things. Arguably, the ribbons, or could be the green on the side, could be Roman. Some say it's a shamrock. But listening to that oath and what inspired it, similar to poems of Robert Burns also writing about the French Revolution and the inspiration from the United States. But with respect to that emblem, which now rests as a flag, by the way, in the R. Robinson Library just off the road for safekeeping, it was brought to these parts by the Armagh militia, seized at the Battle of Balnamuck a few weeks later in that August of 1798, going into September, actually. But what you have here is, again, evidence of that distillation. There is Humber, the French general. He's only 32 years of age. Humber surrenders at Balnamuck to Lake. 14 years later, both men find themselves at opposite ends of the spectrum at the Battle of New Orleans. Humber is number 2. He's the adjutant to the son of Ulster, Andrew Jackson, the only one of the 8 Jackson children not born in Ballybefore outside Carrickfergus. Another irony, and more than a footnote in many ways, but Humber had immigrated to Louisiana and became a teacher, but signed up with Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans, and again encountered Lake. But in the context of ideas and what Paine represented and what was represented by the transfer of ideas to here, the phrase, "These are the times that try men's souls," written in the American Crisis, which inspired Washington's men to give it one more push, understanding that as good a general as Washington was, and again, trained as a British officer in what was called in America the French Indian War of the 1760s, he was a British captain and a major. He was a surveyor by training, working in the western part at what became Fort Pitt. But in the American Revolution, the supreme general who, if captured, would have been hung, drawn, and quartered and taken to London, as would Paine, who had been considered a traitor. He was an Englishman. But it was Paine who pointed at the time of common sense that only 1/3 of the stock of people in the colonies, of those colonies, were in fact English. Others were German. There was the Irish element. There was the Dutch element. There were other elements of people. And one of the things that I owe it, and thank you, James, for pointing that out to me along the way, it lies in the bowels of the Harvard Library system, is the fact that King George III helps inadvertently spark the American Revolution, not simply because of taxation without representation or putting a foreign army in your doors in your homes in Boston or Philadelphia, but also with the idea that he would make the established religion of those colonies. That stuck in the craw of those that left here for religious liberty, be it Presbyterian, be it others who came because they were Quakers, be it others who came because they were Catholic, because the last thing they wanted to see again happen to them was a religious system that in fact had driven them from where they were. Those colonies, if you recall, were set up basically chartered by the Crown in the context of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Virginia Colony, and over time they grew to larger entities with larger structures of governance. So that was something that comes out of that period as well, crucially. But when you look at Paine and what Tom Paine represents, Paine, the 37-year-old ex-British tax collector, ex-privateer, former corset maker, who is a self-educated intellectual. And if you find, I would recommend anybody gets a copy of Common Sense, read how it stands the test of time in many, many ways. We fight not to enslave the earth, but to set a country free and to make room upon the earth for honest men to live in. The Battle of Trenton, a small town outside, became the state capital of New Jersey, was a pivotal battle. December 26, Boxing Day, Stephen's Day, soon after escaping from New York. New York was a Dunkirk. The Battle of New York was, in fact, getting away from the Crown, getting away from the Howe brothers, trying to avoid Cornwallis and swinging across to New Jersey. The rallying cry was, in fact, the cry of "These are the times that try men's souls." It was also what Russell wrote in 1803. Again, these are the times that, quoting Paine directly, that influence coming across the Atlantic. But Paine also wrote about why men should rally together, and women who were with them. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in a crisis shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of all men and women. And Paine said, these are the times that try men's souls. And this was a way of regenerating a spirit of revolution that was under siege. But particularly to be noted, which I emphasized to my friends in America in my recent trip, critical of that was the presence of the French naval blockade at Chesapeake, off Maryland, off Delaware, which bifurcated the Great British Flotilla from crushing the American Revolution at the time of New York and New Jersey. Without that, they were lost. And that's something simply the Americans should never forget in terms of that French intervention. And hence you have the example here of what was attempted by a French landing that failed. In British history, it's called the only foreign invasion to land on British soil. To the Irish, it's something else. So you look at history both ways. To the Irish was an attempt of many of the Irish of a liberation force. So that's what failed at Balnamuck. But the intent of that army was to head to Dublin, not to the north, but the flag is actually in the Armagh Robinson Library. But so I've left you with another document there that has a picture of a tree. That is the Liberty Tree that you see there. And also a seal that may look familiar to you. It appears on federal symbols in the U.S. It is a symbol of the eagle of the United States. When a president speaks, you see the Great Seal of the Union. In the case of the etching, you see it's actually not an eagle, it's a turkey. That was Franklin's recommendation because he thought it was an American bird and more noble than the eagle that was a forager and did cruel things to cats and everything else. So Franklin liked turkeys. But in the end, the eagle prevailed. But that particular etching comes from a man from outside Slough-Neil in Maghera in the county of Derry, and that is Charles Thompson, who some of you will have known of, will have seen his house, a 15-year-old boy who came to the United States as an indentured servant, who was, in effect, America's first and only ever prime minister. Because after the surrender of Cornwallis, when the band played, the world turned upside down at the Battle of Saratoga. That was, in fact, in Yorktown, was in fact the time in which that it was unfurled there, and the context of how the French had a force there at Chesapeake Bay, how the effect of Charles Thompson, 30 miles where he was from in Strabane in County Tyrone, came John Dunlap, who printed the American Declaration of Independence. They met for the first time in Philadelphia. Young immigrant boys who became men, who became independent thinkers, inspired by the ideals of liberty, of the Enlightenment. And now we'll be hearing from Brother James about the Enlightenment. But that's that context of what I call twirling across the ocean between these parts. And ideas are great things to have and great things when we live them and exchange them freely and discuss them in liberty and as free people. So thank you very much for listening to me. We'll be taking some questions after the night, as Fenton may say, or may see, but thanks for listening.